Welcome to the Hedera HashCast, episode 9. I'm your host, Warlock and Key, and in this episode, Deepak and I will be chatting with Vice President and ESG Director at the HBAR Foundation, Wes Geisenberger. How are you, Wes?
I'm good. How are you guys today?
I'm super.
Feeling good.
I'm awake in the morning, you know? That doesn't always happen.
That means it's a good day. So.
That's a good day. Being awake in general, instead of not being awake, I think it makes it a good day. I've got some very important questions for you, Wes. Number one, do you like anime?
I like anime. I'm probably not as well versed in anime as I should be. But,
not a great start. Not a great start, folks. We want to only get anime fans on here, but I'll make an exception. I'm gonna transition this an anime podcast later. It's gonna become one. You know, that's my long-term goal. How much free time do you have, Wes?
Usually not very much, and that's a good thing because I spend a lot of time working with the community, especially the sustainability community on Hedera. So most of my days are filled with talking to different folks and applications who are building and creating all sorts of new ecosystem partnerships around sustainability. You know, measuring things like carbon emissions, capturing offsets, and everywhere in between.
And you're flying around the whole world, right? You're traveling a lot.
I am traveling. So we actually, just came back from the Asia Pacific region. We had a really awesome Australia blockchain week. As part of that, we announced 3 new grantees out of the Sustainable Impact Fund that folks may have seen some of the announcements on. Timeless, who was a first grantee out of Australia, who has some great projects with companies like Yuan, government of Queensland, government, not necessarily a company, as well as the Trove project out of Amsterdam, where they're doing some energy trading, which is pretty cool. Our second one was Miko. When some folks may be familiar with Miko as a privacy and decentralized identifier-based wallet, who's very interested in participating in the sustainability ecosystem because we have this open source tool called the Guardian, which is built on decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. And they see an opportunity to grow their application into something they've called Trust-Rate, to be able to see more attributes around things like carbon offsets and carbon emissions for various projects and serve the ecosystem that way. And last but certainly not least, we had a great announcement with Civic Ledger, who has this awesome product called Water Ledger, where they do water rights trading. They're actually doing that with different folks around Australia and around the world. So it was a really successful week. And there were some other great announcements in Australia as well for folks who saw the announcement from ANZ. It was a really awesome week there. And we went to a few other locations throughout APAC, but we'll talk about those more probably in the future as we have some other grantees coming up.
So getting to kind of the basics here. For those who may not be familiar, ESG director, what does that mean?
So when we think about ESG, it's a lot of times we're talking about the E, especially in our ecosystem, but it's environmental, societal, and governance focused areas of a corporation. And the counterpart to ESG is other types of sustainability goals that oftentimes come from projects that are out in the world where companies say, I want to make sure that I'm contributing positively in the world. It's not just marketing, that things are actually happening, whether I'm measuring carbon emissions in a granular way, whether I'm making sure I have the right social goals for my company, making sure the company's governed well, making sure that there's not fraud in the supply chains. We aren't participating in supply chains with modern slavery, making sure that we're doing the right things as a company at a very high level. Now, oftentimes they're doing things like buying credits, especially when it comes to the environmental space, or maybe making sure they procured renewable energy. So you see companies like Google talking about their goals around 24/7, making sure that every single electron is traceable, making sure that they procure only renewable and carbon-free energy actually is their goal. And so those are types of things that fall within the ESG domain. But oftentimes it's about proving it, making sure that that information is trustworthy and not just saying that we're accomplishing our environmental, societal, and governance goals as a corporation.
So why are these goals so important to the HBAR Foundation?
Well, so not only do we value them as a company ourselves, as a fund, but we want to help companies as well as help individuals make the world more sustainable. We see a really good opportunity too, because how do you know? How do you trust information? Let's just take the environmental example. When somebody says, I bought a carbon offset, when I bought a renewable energy credit, how do you know what went into that? Oftentimes, there are projects, halfway around the world where somebody says, I planted a tree or a series of trees. And how do you even know it's the right tree for that location? In some places in the world, if you plant the wrong tree, it takes water. It changes how the water table works in that region. So maybe if you plant the wrong tree, it's actually bad for the environment. Now, oftentimes we're oversimplifying things when we're saying planting trees, but we're actually trying to remove metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere. We're trying to improve the state of the environment because a company says, I've emitted a certain amount of emissions. I want to become carbon neutral. And so oftentimes there's a process for both measuring emissions as well as measuring carbon capture or measuring any type of environmental benefit. And that usually involves multiple parties. And so when we say multiple parties, oftentimes, my senses, if I had spidey senses, they go off and they say, well, okay, well, this may be a blockchain problem. This may be an issue where there's double spend, or I can't trust every step of the process, especially if it's from multiple parties. And so from a DLT perspective, it becomes a really good use case because we can have identifiers for all these different actors, the folks who collect the scientific evidence that something is happening, the folks who define the process also have to have identifiers, the folks who audit that process, the folks who participate or finance that process, all have to work together to capture a certain amount of carbon or measure a certain amount of carbon that's emitted. And of course, then we have to be able to facilitate the exchange of, hey, I've created a credit that has gone into this, and then move it from one side of the market to the buyer. And these are all really good opportunities for folks who are building on distributed ledger technologies. And so where Hedera comes in is we say, well, we are a really good high throughput public ledger that is extremely secure, that also has this concept of fairness built in, fairness of fees, fairness of order of transactions, which you may care about if you're a mom and pop trying to compete against a large energy company to create the next renewable energy credit. Then you get fairness of that transaction with a unique timestamp, and you have fair access to submit it to any node on the network. And all of these properties play out really well in this decentralized economy where you have different roles and actors in each type of credit and each type of unit of energy sold. And that's a really big opportunity for folks who are building on Hedera to take advantage of, but also an opportunity for the HBAR Foundation to invest in building applications that care about granular, transparent information and actually changing how we account for these assets that are oftentimes centrally managed today, but not managed with that granular degree of detail involved that we can actually improve on by using Hedera.
So the Sustainable Impact Fund, which was launched March 10th, it's a fund of $100 million. What's the basic mission statement for what we're trying to do with this money and what you guys are basically after when it comes to funding people?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And so what we are looking to do is improve transparency. Oftentimes it's in environmental markets, but it can go into the wider UN Sustainable Development Goals as well, where there's a lack of transparency of information, where we're financializing an asset most of the time, whether it's a carbon offset, carbon removal, renewable energy credit, whatever it may be. And there's a lot of roles and actors involved. Being able to create that asset on Hedera is a really difficult thing. Being able to create it without Hedera is a next to impossible thing because you have to figure out all the different folks organize an ecosystem. And today, when you try to go do that, there's maybe 20 companies in the world that can audit that. There's maybe 5 to 10 voluntary registries and a few compliance registries that can move these assets. And we see an opportunity to invest in both the folks who create the assets, the folks who exchange the assets, and the folks who are creating demand for those assets in supply chain settings who are measuring their carbon emissions. And we're investing in all of those areas. And what we want to do is improve the transparency and the quality of the assets in the market, improve the rate of exchange, and make them all discoverable and transparent. And so if you had to distill it down to a few key things, it's improving auditability in the markets, discoverability of the assets linked to that audit trail that we can get on Hedera, and improve the liquidity or the ability to trade the assets in a way that makes more sense. A lot of times today in markets around things like carbon offsets, 20 to 40% of the credit is lost to the middlemen in between. And we want to be able to make it so, like in Dovo's case, which is our first grantee, the farmer actually sets the price. It's kind of a beautiful thing. If a farmer says, I want to sell a credit for $20 or a credit for $35, they get to set it. They're not losing 20% of that. They get to set the price. They get to do it equitably. And folks who value the credit at whatever price they set, they can buy it and get all the auditable information that otherwise in another scenario, they wouldn't have access to. And so we're excited about that opportunity to improve auditability, discoverability, and better liquidity or trading of these assets. And that's what the Sustainable Impact Fund is here for.
I mean, increasing the amount of honesty in this area is obviously a good thing. What are some additional kind of side financial incentives for what you're doing, driving standardization in the sustainability markets?
Yeah, so we're spending a lot of time building open source infrastructure, but that infrastructure is built on standards. That's really one of the things we're focused on. So taking things like the IWA or the Interwork Alliance standards, which is actually now part of a group called the GBDC, but taking the standards that we've built in the Sustainability Business Working Group to define tokens, define specific attributes around tokens that are making up these credits, define how they're related back to the information behind them, that audit trail, using W3C standards, those decentralized identifier standards. We're building open source infrastructure like the Guardian, which is a framework for taking policies or methodologies for different things like environmental processes, accounting for carbon emissions, accounting for, say, how many trees does it take to measure up to a metric ton in a given year based on all the different factors of the geolocation of the trees, the type of trees, and is it actually additional in avoiding something like planned deforestation? Those are the types of processes that we're mapping using standards in the Guardian. And that's part of what we call our critical infrastructure program, taking open source infrastructure that allows a project to map that policy, get a token live, and focus on working with their partners to get to the token minting in a trustworthy way. And what we do is we kind of set a goal and said, well, could we take an application development cycle and shorten it from 6 to 12 months to maybe just 2 to 3 months in the full application and maybe just a few weeks in creating a policy? That's kind of our goal with the critical infrastructure program. We take difficult processes to create an audit trail and mint a token, and make it easy for application builders on Hedera. The folks like Timeless, the folks like Dovo that we've talked about. And there's more than just the Guardian path. We'll have some other areas that we focus on. You've probably seen the announcement where Miko said, hey, we're going to open source a lot of the information or a lot of the frameworks that we're building around Trustery, the Explorer, as well as the wallet components. And that's exciting to us. It's exciting to be able to allow folks to build faster and build based on these open source standards, whether it's the W3C or the token taxonomy framework within the IWA.
Let's talk a little more specifics on Guardian. What kind of tooling do you expect will be required when building around Guardian-based processes?
Yeah, so with the Guardian, it's pretty cool. You can manage a token that comes out of the Guardian because it's an HTS token in any wallet that you use today. However, if you want the context of seeing all the decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials tied to that token, you may need something more specialized like Miko or applications that choose to support that standard, just like if you were to support an NFT standard or any other type of token standards. Now, being the Guardian is, open source, a lot of folks should be able to pick up what those tokens look like, understanding how the memo fields are used, understanding how to relate to some of the data that's stored in those verifiable credentials and DIDs. Actually uses IPFS. So again, a lot of pretty standard DLT tooling. And those are the first things you probably need. When it comes to trading the assets, they'll be tradable on a few different varieties of exchanges in the future. We've alluded to and talked a little bit in the public domain about this concept of an automated regression market, which folks can think about like an AMM for NFTs, but that's something we'll probably get into more depth in the future on. With the Guardian, though, the first thing you need is a wallet that can support the token and the ability to create the tokens. And if you're a developer, the Guardian should be pretty accessible. It's built in JavaScript, and a lot of the policies are created using JSON. So it's relatively developer accessible rather than learning complex languages like Solidity or other complex coding languages.
One question I have, Wes, is Miko is the product that is produced by FPOS, correct, in Australia?
So actually, FPOS used Miko as part of their pilot, and so Miko is an independent company. They have operations both in Australia as well as in Europe, and they're used by companies around the world who look to them as a decentralized identity leader.
So we've got a few projects that we're supporting with the Sustainable Impact Fund. Any word on when we might see some new projects being added to this list?
The closest thing I can to giving you information on that is saying soon. We have a lot of different projects that are coming down the pipe. Look for some new geographies is maybe the first thing I can say. We've talked about Dovo, who's based in the UK, has farms in Europe as well. We've talked about a few different companies out of Australia, but new geographies is the first kind of breadcrumb I can leave out there. I think there's quite a few companies that if you're looking ahead on the testnet, seeing who's testing ESG focused tokens, you may see some of those names. But we're really excited about the different roadmap of who may be deploying things like an automated regression market, who may be deploying the next type of token. And we're not we're not looking at trying to recreate the wheel on the carbon markets in the sense of they're going to follow the types of verified emission reductions or REDD+ methodologies that exist. We're going to let the scientists do the science, but the applications that'll be deploying will be around the world, mapping these processes that already exist onto the Guardian and creating new types of platforms to do so. So that's about what I can give you today without saying too many names. So.
All right, well, say someone out there is interested in developing a project with a focus on environmental sustainability. How should they approach it?
So the first thing I would say is based on where you're located around the world, understand what type of impact you can create. Understand what types of projects exist within your region. Look at whether it's based on water, whether it's based on biodiversity, whether it's based on specific types of environmental actions, and focus on making sure the science supports whatever you're looking to do. From it, there's this concept that we really harp on in the Sustainable Impact Fund or the SIF. It's making sure we're meeting the different requirements that the industry prescribes, specifically additionality. Is the project additional? We don't want to be tokenizing trees that already exist and would exist 50 years from now. We want to make that transparent next step to capture carbon. We want to make sure we're working with durable projects, making sure we're working with projects that don't have leakage, where you take a step to say plant a forest of trees that next forest over is being cut down. We don't want to have emissions because we fund a project who takes that step. And then I would say if you've identified that scientific process, take a look at the Guardian of how you can map it. One thing that's really exciting is a lot of the folks who build policies or methodologies in the Guardian, they're making it all open source. And so, one of the popular methodologies is called REDD+. It's oftentimes related to forestry, almost all the time is related to forestry. And there's open source code that we've just released actually around avoiding planned deforestation policies. But there's others that are going to come. And we've released renewable energy credit policies and methodologies as getting started points. And that's actually a good area that you can look to see where folks may be developing in the future. And it's a good starting point if you're thinking about building a policy. How do I get granular information that can kind of work with the rest of the markets on Hedera to deliver high value credits and build a business around? One of the things we're really bullish about as well is we're working with businesses that we think are going to exist in 10, 15 years, 20 years, 100 years, no different than Hedera looking to be a 100+ year company. We think that, the projects that we work with, having sustainable business models on top of being sustainable projects is really important as well.
And and there are a lot of sustainability organizations that exist, in the world. How can we make it easier and more attractive for them to integrate into the network and make the work they do more verifiable and transparent?
So I think there's a really awesome opportunity because folks are doing a lot of great work around the world, but they're not yet using DLT tooling. And I think that's
Right.
a great opportunity for us to use tools like the Guardian to map their processes that they're already doing and make them more transparent. Of course, if you make them more transparent and you enrich that data by making it also more discoverable, so going back to auditability, discoverability, and then liquidity, oftentimes if you make your products available to the entire world, people may be willing to pay a higher price for it. And that's, I think, an opportunity where if you're talking to anyone in the community or the community's talking and kind of evangelizing what we're doing on Hedera, that bringing a tool like the Guardian in may add a good bit of value to their business by making the work that they're doing more accessible to the rest of the world. And where we can figure out a policy that maps to the science, oftentimes we can tease out value. And especially for making it more auditable, more discoverable, more liquid, we can bring the learnings from DLT into the businesses that exist today, doing the good work around improving the environment.
Now, zooming out a little bit, the HBAR Foundation has been announcing quite a few of these large funds for specific purposes recently. The Sustainable Impact Fund on March 10th, the Crypto Economy Fund, or as a lot of people call it, the DeFi Fund, on March 29th, and the Metaverse Fund, which was the most recent, I believe, on April 9th. What's the reasoning behind this new approach?
I think it's really defining, and following kind of the announcement of all the funds up front, even before that, it's defining where we're spending a lot of our time, energy, and resources. So you've probably heard a lot from Alex or Elaine speaking about those individual funds and other funds, that we're putting our energy into. I think it gives the community a way to engage based on the type of projects that they're building, but also tells the community where we really value spending our time to see big outcomes on Hedera. And the reason why we have focused funds is because we see these as massive growth opportunities. I'm really proud of the fact that Hedera is the first, layer one, and the HBAR Foundation's out in front leading with the Sustainable Impact Fund. We're the first fund of its kind in the industry. And you can speak to the size of the other funds, and I think it tells exactly the level of commitment that we have in terms of these different areas. And it gives folks an idea, well, maybe I can move my project in 6 months if I was already building it on Hedera by applying for a grant. Maybe I can accelerate because someone at the foundation and the broader Hedera community can help me with technical or operational expertise in this area. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're spending a lot of time and resources and energy to help the community grow faster. And that's what these funds are all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really smart idea to just partition them and then talk about that. So, if it's just a general fund, maybe you don't think that your project can relate. Maybe you don't think your project is important enough, or, if it's more artist based, the Metaverse Fund, seeing that can help you be like, oh, okay, put the pieces together. I mean, that's half of like any kind of marketing venture is just like getting people to put the pieces together and why they need to listen, right? Just for people out there, the Metaverse Fund was allocated $250 million, while the Crypto Economy Fund was allocated $155 million. So going forward, right? I mean, we've had a pretty strong start to the year. Going forward, what's kind of the roadmap for what the HBAR Foundation is going to be focusing on?
So I don't want to speak for the foundation as a whole, because I think that I'll leave it to some other folks to talk about that. But I can speak kind of selfishly to the Sustainable Impact Fund.
Sure.
And we have things like I mentioned the critical infrastructure plan that we're working on, and it starts with the Guardian. In the future, it's going to go beyond things like explorers that Miko's standing up. It's going to go into things like the automated regression market, the ability to facilitate trading, the ability to facilitate these different assets that are going to be able to move in a more free-flowing way than the carbon markets have ever seen. This, I think, is a really exciting area. The ability for smart contracts to be able to buy and sell these assets in a way where it identifies promising attributes. I mentioned additionality, durability, leakages, a couple attributes, but there's many more. There's a really nice tweet thread by Matt Smithies talking about the different roles and actors that he's looking to enable staking on the reputation of folks involved in the carbon markets. So that
Right.
audit trail, he's enabling staking based on if projects are getting reversed or if there's something that's not true within someone who's auditing or verifying a baseline of a project. And imagine a market that can better facilitate that information and having a smart contract that's powered by machine learning models to do just that. Those are the types of investments that we're looking to make and make them in a way that is open source and so that people can build and learn and create composable infrastructure around the building blocks, the sustainable building blocks that we're putting out there. I think that's a pretty exciting area because when we look at the funds, and this is not unique to the Sustainable Impact Fund, it's about open source infrastructure that we can put out there to accelerate the building and adoption for every single builder in the Hedera ecosystem. Of course, that yields projects coming to market faster so that the broader community can engage. The broader community can buy, sell, and trade freely. And there may be some really interesting opportunities where Hedera shows up and you don't even know it's there. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about what we have coming up. And it all starts with the infrastructure, of course, being able to build faster and get in folks' hands quicker.
What's interesting is it seems like the stuff you're working on is not only building on what is already existing, but very new assets, correct? Like, I think Justin has talked about assets that are not fungible, but not non-fungible at the same time in an automated regression market. Do you have any context behind that? Because I'm really curious about it.
Yeah, so a lot of times we see things like carbon credits or greenhouse gas equivalent credits commoditized in traditional markets today. What the ARM is looking to do is provide liquidity for non-fungible assets. And this really isn't done in markets today. Most markets are based on, can we make everything the same and trade it at a indexed value? Of course, if you know things that could have a similar property, like a metric ton, but they come from all over the world, from different methodologies done by different folks. At the end of the day, there's not that many things outside of the metric ton that's exactly the same. Now, it could be very similar. A forest in Brazil could be very similar to a forest in Kenya. Could be different trees, could be different fauna, could be different, all sorts of things. However, it may have the same ability to capture a certain amount of carbon based on the size of the forest, but how it's audited, how it's maintained could be totally different. And so that ability for the ARM to evaluate the differences, the attributes behind it, is one of the unique traits that we're trying to tease out. Now it's again developing new types of technology, doing a lot of different research, working with our partners, but that's what the ARM is really focused on. Now, many of these assets today maybe they have an abstraction layer where they have a non-fungible asset behind them, but they're grouped upwards or grouped in lots. And in this case, we're still taking those assets and trying to tease out the information behind them. And I think that's where Justin's kind of talking about the work behind the ARM that's going on. But it's, we're still in early days, but I think it's a really hopeful area, and it's a promising area where, we can make a big change, not just how carbon offsets are traded or renewable energy credits are traded, but many assets that we are treating as commodities, maybe traded differently in the future because of this type of technology.
Now, Dovo has come up a few times, and we've had multiple episodes talking about it. I'm curious, how has it been working with them?
Fantastic. I really enjoy working with Irvan Kras, Matt, Nim, the entire team. That they really have been, stalwarts of the Hedera community since relatively early days. I think Dovo spent a lot of time in a hackathon actually. And they've been regulars in the latest few hackathons, as well as speaking publicly. And I can't speak highly enough of the team. I think one of the reasons they were the first grant out of the Sustainable Impact Fund is not just because they have a great project, but because of their commitment to the community And that was something that we wanted to go out with and go out with a bang, setting the right tone with projects that engage, not just with corporates and enterprises, but the entire Hedera community. And I think you're going to see them continue to engage. They talked a little bit about the staking that they're working on, which I think the community, if you're one of the first 100 lucky folks to engage, got to participate in, and I'm sure that will open up in the near future. So,
yeah, I think we might be up to 300 at this point. I think they might have just done that. But some of us were in the first 15. Just let me just stretch and flex here.
What did you think of it? I'm just turning the interview around. So now I need a review. So
I mean, it's just real easy. Getting the Ethereum Dovo to HTS, because I'm the one that made the tutorials. Not that easy. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be a need for tutorials. But staking itself is super simple. You have your wallet. You just make an account with an email on the Dovo site, and you just put your account number, and it just starts. And it just does 15-minute check-ins.
And that's exactly what we want to see from different projects, is finding different ways to engage. And then once it's there, it's easy. So I'm glad to hear that. I try to, refrain from taking a spot from folks in the community, because, my role is to help spread the funds, not take them from other folks. But, I'm excited to hear it's going super well. So.
No, it's been going great, and super easy. And there's none of that lockup stuff. I experimented more with staking right before, because I wanted to know what the deal was before staking came out for Dovo. It's just much simpler than any other process out there, to my knowledge at least. So it's been great.
Awesome.
All right, well, I think that's a good stopping point. I think we covered a lot of interesting information. Thank you, Wes, for agreeing to be here. I really appreciate it. And I think the information you provided today will be very useful to many people out there. I'm going to try not to slam my desk with my knees. I'm a tall boy, 6'4", so sometimes the world is not built for me. I'll just say that.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate being here, and thank you again for having me. It was a lot of fun. So.
Now, if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter at Hedera HashCast, and consider supporting us via Patreon or by buying one of our new patron NFTs. If you hate Patreon and don't want to give them a certain portion of the funds you'd be giving me for fees. Thank you for listening and for helping to build a consensus in the Hedera community. Thank you to our patrons: ABFT, FTW, Moon88, and DJ.